Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel where I present you this Hyundai, or Hyundai as the Koreans like to pronounce it. This is the Super 286e, a PC that looks a little bit boring at first glance, but wait until we turn it on. There's no denying that this beautiful amber monitor slowly waking up does give it a little bit extra. Also, the humming of the PC, the disk drive initializing and the hard drive doing its work already makes it kind of special. To top it off, the clicky keys on this AT style keyboard. But it's true, at first glance this does seem a little dull. It has 3 LEDs, one for the hard drive, an 8 MHz and 12 MHz indication. We have a 1.44 megabyte floppy drive and room for 2 more 5-inch devices. We have a power button and a reset button. When we start the PC, it will automatically start at 12 MHz as indicated by the CMOS setup that we'll look at in a bit. And we can control the speed using the keyboard, as the case itself lacks a turbo button. But we can toggle the CPU speed using Ctrl Alt plus or Ctrl Alt minus. Back is just as rudimentary as the front. We have the Super 286e badge here. This dates from September 1990. We have the power supply unit here with AC out, AC in. We only have 2 ports, one parallel port and a serial port, and an AT style keyboard connector. We also have a 9-pin D-sub connector for video and some dip switches. Now, when I first started the PC, it made a horrible clicking sound. It was like a Christmas tree with the LEDs blinking very rapidly, and all of a sudden a horrible smell emerged from the case. So I decided to open it up to see what happened inside. So those paying close attention will probably see the blown tantalum capacitors here, hidden away behind this graphics card from ATI, the Small Wonder Graphics Solution version 1 that we'll take a closer look at later on. And here you see the capacitors, so let's zoom in a little bit. And 2 of them have definitely blown up. The third one seems to be okay, but we're probably going to be replacing that one as well. As you can see here, we have some capacitor debris scattered around the case. The explosion also left this kind of blackish debris scattered around the power supply and the expansion slots. So the layout is pretty standard. We have the power supply, we have the 5¼ inch drive bay here. We have the main board with a couple of 16-bit ISA slots and 8-bit ISA slots. Here on top of the 5¼ inch drive bays, we have some switch and jumper settings for the memory, monitor type, if you want to enable, disable the ID hard drive or floppy drive controller, serial parallel port settings. So this is very convenient in terms of documentation. The way that the power button works is through this metal rod thing, which is hooked up to the actual power connector of the power supply unit. A mechanism you see a lot in these types of desktop cases. So let's start disassembly, and we'll start with these 5¼ inch drive bays. So let's remove this front plate here, where we see that a hard drive is sitting there. Not really sure if this is an MFM or an IDE hard drive, but we'll see that later on. So the disk drive just slides on out like so. So it's using these rails here that you put on the 5¼ inch housing so that it can slide on out. And here we have the hard drive, a K-Lock model KL343, a notoriously bad hard drive for its day. It's one of these first IDE hard drives which were very unreliable, so yeah, we'll see how this one turns out. Let's disconnect the power from the main board. As you can see here, we have a Dallas battery. We have some dip switches here. We also have some cables for the LEDs and the buttons which are on the front side of the case. And to remove the mainboard, we also need to remove these little bolts here on the ports, which kind of broke off. Yeah, I'm not really sure what's happening here, but I'm unable to unscrew them without them breaking off. Now the mainboard is also held in place by a couple of screws here that I will be removing. There's one more screw here hidden away next to these flat cables from the IDE controller and the floppy controller. So we'll go ahead and remove those as well. So no MFM hard drive, this is pure IDE. And now we can easily remove the mainboard from the case. It just slides on out like this. I'm also going to be removing the power supply, as I also want to test this power supply in a more isolated way without hooking up the mainboard first. And there you have it, a carcass of the Hyundai Super 286E, completely stripped. And now let's take a look at the individual components. And we'll start with the power supply, which I have hooked up to an IDE hard drive here. So let's turn it on and check out the voltages. So here I have hooked up my multimeter to the 12 volt rail, which is looking really good. 12.07. Let's now hook it up to the 5 volt rail. And here we have 5.12 volt, which is also okay. Notice how it uses a slightly different color scheme, where red is normally 5 volts and yellow is normally 12 volts. But it's the opposite here. Now that we know that the power supply is okay, let's focus on the blown capacitors here on the main board. And we will need to be removing these 3 capacitors. Now there are a couple of ways of doing that. We can use a desoldering pump. If the components are in a really bad shape, they will be kind of difficult to remove because there's not a lot of material to hold on to. I really should have done this before removing the first capacitor, but let's look at the pin out of the power supply. So the first 3 pins are the plus 5 volts. And they are hooked up to those capacitors here sitting just beneath the power supply connector. And they are fine, there are no shorts to ground, which is good. So let's take a look at the minus 5 volts, which is hooked up to this one. So this one also seems to be fine, but I am going to be replacing it because I need to replace the other 2 as well, so better be safe than sorry. The plus 12 volts is or was hooked up to the capacitor that we just removed, so that one was definitely bad. And the minus 12 volts is hooked up to this capacitor here, which is also blown up, and this is also shorted to ground, so this is also a capacitor that we need to remove and replace. Now another way to remove the capacitors is just to put the board upside down, straighten up the pins a little bit, and just heat up the pads, and then just wiggle the capacitor out on the other side. When the pads have heated up sufficiently, it should drop just right out. And here you can actually see the damage of the capacitor. So we'll do the same thing for the third capacitor. Just wiggle it out. So this one was still in pretty decent shape, but better be safe than sorry. So I'm just going to be cleaning up this area a little bit. And it's also very important to make sure that all of the holes in the PCB here are sufficiently cleaned up. You can use, if you have like a backlight or something, you can visually inspect that the holes have been cleaned up sufficiently in order for the new capacitors to be put in. So that's what we're going to be doing now. You need to take into account the polarity of the capacitors because there's also a negative volt rail here. So make sure that they are oriented properly. Usually it's marked on the silk screen of the PCB. So let's add some flux here and solder the new capacitors in place. Clip up the legs and see if the issue has been resolved. So with a minimal setup, the power supply, main board, and video card, we can power on the system, hook up a monitor to it, and hopefully, yep, we see the amber screen slowly glowing up. We do see a failure on the CMOS battery, and that is due to this Dallas RTC chip here on the main board that luckily we can replace with a brand new one with the DS1287A. Now luckily this Dallas RTC chip was socketed, so it's just a matter of gently prying it out and hooking up the new one into the socket, and we should be good to go. I suggest you buy these chips new and not off of eBay, as chances are that these are going to be recycled ones from old computers with dead batteries. Now we're still getting a failure, but that's just because we haven't set up the CMOS just yet. So we will enter the CMOS setup utility, set up some values. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to configure this KLOC KL343 hard drive in the CMOS setup utility because the predefined list of hard drives didn't include the cylinders, heads, and sectors that this KLOC drive expects. So I chose the nearest one. I still got an error here because I didn't set up the video correctly, which needs to be set to mono in the BIOS. But now the CMOS battery and checksum is okay, but the hard drive didn't boot. It said missing operating system, so I was able to go into the C drive, which appeared to be empty. I did notice that there was a partition here, but it was a 40 megabyte partition, whereas the total disk space here was set to 31 megabytes. So this 31 megabyte comes from the cylinder head and sector configuration in the CMOS, which appears to be incorrect because there was already a 40 megabyte partition on the hard drive, and the hard drive is in fact a 40 megabyte hard drive. And also when I try to repartition the hard drive and do a MS-DOS format on it, initially it all went well, but in the end I got a lot of bad sectors on the hard drive, 2 megabytes in total, which is a lot for a 30 or 40 megabyte hard drive. And after rebooting, I got this garbage text instead of the MS-DOS loading up. And so again, I went into the CMOS setup utility and chose a different disk geometry. So here we have the KLOC specs as indicated by the manufacturer, the CMOS type 41 that we just tried. But now I'm going to try this CMOS type 24, one from a Connor 40 megabyte hard drive, which I found in a similar system. Now this doesn't seem to correspond with the KLOC drive, but I was able to partition the drive with these settings, a full 40 megabyte partition. So as you can see, the total disk space now is 41 megabytes instead of 31. And when I did the format, everything went fine. There were a couple of allocation errors during the format, but there was only about 6 kilobytes of bad sectors. And more importantly, when I restarted the computer, it was able to start from the hard drive. So there was no garbage text being displayed here. Instead, we got the starting MS-DOS prompt, which was really nice. And here we have a good view of the main board, which is obviously a proprietary form factor. This will not fit in a standard AT case. It does have 6 ISA slots. 4 of them are 16-bit ISA, 2 of them are 8-bit. We have the memory section down below here for banks. Now each bank is made up of 8 chips. And an additional chip for parity. Now every chip that you see here contains 262 144 bits or 256 kilobit of dynamic random access memory. So multiplied by 8, 256 kilobytes on each banks times 4, giving us a total of 1 megabyte of RAM. On the main board we also have a switch block and a set of jumpers here. These are all pretty well documented here on the case itself, so it allows you to specify the memory size, monitor type. It also allows you to enable, disable the onboard IDE connector, the floppy drive controller, serial parallel port. So the BIOS on this main board is included on these two chips here. It's an award BIOS, copyright 1990. We also have the onboard floppy drive and hard drive controller, so you can hook up a floppy drive and a hard drive directly onto the main board, which is pretty convenient. We also have onboard parallel and serial port that we can also configure using the jumpers. We have a standard AT style keyboard connector hooked up on the main board. We have the Dallas RTC chip, which is the clock chip that allows the computer to keep track of time, but it's also used to power the CMOS so that you don't lose your settings on each reboot. So we replaced that one already. We have the standard AT style power connector on the main board that follows the standard AT pinout. Next to the Dallas chip, we also have the keyboard controller chip. On the main board, we also have various connectors for the LEDs, PC speaker. And at the heart of this computer, we have the Intel 286 12 MHz CPU with an optional floating point unit, which is not installed here. This main board comes with a VLSI chipset, a very popular chipset for 286 and 386 based computers. Moving to the power supply unit, pretty standard power supply with a standard AT style connector. It is missing the plus 5 volt on this side here, much like the older XT computers, but other than that it uses the standard AT style pinout. It has a couple of Molex connectors for the hard drive and the disk drives. The floppy drive is a standard 3.5 inch 1.44 megabyte floppy drive. It uses this old style connector here that you normally see in 5.25 inch floppy drives, but it can be removed in order to use a standard cable. It's fitted in a 5.25 inch housing. Here we have a very early IDE hard drive from K-Lock, the KL343. This is one of the early IDE hard drives. It's not very reliable, but it seems to work fine, so I was able to format it. It had a few bad sectors, but I haven't had any issues with it. I like that cranky old sound that these old hard drives make with these old stepper motors here. So yeah, a little bit of history right here. The video card is an ATI Small Wonder Graphics Solutions version 1. So this is a very early ATI graphics card. It is able to do MDA, Hercules, CGA. It has composite support, but the header is not soldered onto the card. It does have 4 dip switches, allowing you to configure the various video modes and the monitor type that you want to attach to this video card. So now that we've covered all of the components, the time has come to put everything back together again. So I already mentioned this 5.25 inch drive bay area here with the hard drive and the floppy drive, but there's one more area here where we can store something, and that's this really slimline 5.25 inch floppy drive, which can sit just above the 3.5 inch floppy drive. I don't have any rails for it, unfortunately, so I cannot install it on this machine, so I'll have to leave that for next time. But now the PC is ready, so I've decided to install Microsoft MS-DOS 6.22 on it, just because I had it readily available here on some disks. The install went really fine. didn't have any issues with it. I think this is one of these types of computers which was primarily used in office environments where you didn't really need anything more than an amber monochrome display to do your word processing. Other than that, it's a very basic system. There is very little connectivity, there is no sound, no networking, no additional ports. It's just your very basic business type system. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Now it's time for me to get some work done on this machine. So I've installed WordPerfect 5.1 and I'm gonna leave you with this. See you guys next time. Bye bye.